Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Our top story today, Britain's surveillance agency GCHQ has described claims that it was asked by President Obama to spy on Donald Trump as utterly ridiculous. It is unusual for the agency to issue public statements, but it says that claims first made on Fox News and repeated by the White House press secretary are nonsense and should be ignored. Well, our news correspondent Richard Lister is with us. Richard, tell us first of all how it came about that GCHQ was in the frame on this.
Well, I suppose we should go back to the original allegation, of course, which came from President Trump, who said on 4th of March in a string of tweets, "Terrible, just found out Obama had my wires tapped in Trump Tower just before the victory. Nothing found. This is McCarthyism." So immediately, of course, the White House press corps were trying to get to the bottom of this. What evidence was there that there was any tapping or surveillance of the Trump campaign? Now, this was never really answered by the White House, who pointed to various media sources, but they didn't give any specifics. And yesterday, the Senate Intelligence Committee said categorically there was no evidence of any surveillance. That was put back to Sean Spicer in the little clip we just saw. And he said that President Trump stood by those claims because, he said, it was reported on Fox News by a commentator, Judge Andrew Napolitano, and the report on Fox says sources have told Fox News that President Obama could very easily, and probably did, use a foreign intelligence service to gather information for him, and the probable culprit here is called GCHQ. So that is how GCHQ comes into the frame.
And GCHQ have said it is categorically untrue.
They have, and they almost never comment about things. They tend to neither confirm nor deny, and really they do not issue statements as a matter of policy. But the statement they've issued in response to this is quite categorical. It says, recent allegations made by media commentator Judge Andrew Napolitano about GCHQ being asked to conduct wiretapping against the then president-elect are nonsense. And it goes on to say they are utterly ridiculous and should be ignored.
Thank you, Richard. Let's go back to our main news. Britain's surveillance agency GCHQ has described claims that it was asked by President Obama to spy on Donald Trump as utterly ridiculous. It's unusual for the agency to issue public statements, but it says that claims first made on Fox News and repeated by the White House press secretary are nonsense and should be ignored. Former MI5 intelligence officer Ben Owen joins us live from our Salford studio. We're also joined by former intelligence officer for the Ministry of Defence and Cabinet Office, Crispin Black in Dorset. Thank you both very much for joining us. So Crispin Black, do you think that this is just a ridiculous premise?
I don't think it's ridiculous at all. The trouble is we're all fast going up a cul-de-sac. We've been subjected to a cascade of anonymously sourced so-called information about President Trump's connections to Russia. He's a sort of Manchurian candidate sponsored by the successors to the KGB. There's no evidence for that, but it's been covered quite generously in the press. Now the White House appears to have struck back with anonymously sourced deep throat allegations of its own, and they're being quickly dismissed. It seems to me inconsistently, very inconsistent to cover these stories in that way.
And what is your view, Ben Owen?
As GCHQ have put themselves, it is, in my opinion, it is utterly ridiculous. These allegations don't have any tangible evidence unless something's changed overnight. It's not something that British intelligence would entertain, in my opinion. It's not lawful. British intelligence is inherently covered by processes and law, and they stick to it. They have to stick to the law, the letter of the law. It's governed very well. This is not something GCHQ would do, and as they've said, I think this is utterly ridiculous.
Crispin Black, have to stick to processes and the law, do they?
Well, we just don't know. I mean, these allegations are from anonymous sources, and they're unproven, but the White House spokesman, Commander Spicer, is saying very clearly that there is something in them. So do you either believe the GCHQ spokesman or do you believe President Trump's spokesman? And I think Which one you choose to believe rather depends on your political views about what's going on in the United States. There doesn't seem to be any middle ground at all. Remember also, the NSA in the United States is also governed by law. But look what we discovered about them last year through WikiLeaks. Chancellor Merkel's mobile phone bugged, 125 senior German officials bugged by the NSA. Sometimes intelligence agencies, it may well not be the case this time, sometimes they do operate both outside the law and outside the bounds of common sense.
I mean, you say, who do you believe, GCHQ or President Trump's spokesman? Absolutely nothing has come out in the United States to give any credibility to the claims in terms of evidence, has it?
No, but absolutely nothing's come out to give any credibility to the concerns about Trump's connections to Russia. There's no smoking gun. There doesn't appear to be any evidence. The media have been covering it with relish and enthusiasm. It seems to me you've either got to believe that the Russian allegations about Trump are baloney, in which case the GCHQ allegations are probably baloney. But if you believe that the Russian allegations about Trump, there might be something in them, then it's also logical that you believe that his allegations about or his spokesman's allegations about GCHQ, there may be some basis in fact.
Ben Owens, what do you say to that?
I have to agree that yes, your opinion is very much based on your political views in America right now. This is a phenomenon, what we're experiencing in America. No one saw it coming, so the narrative around it is quite exciting. And what way do you go? Are you pro or not pro-Trump? I think the broader issue with this story dates back to the Snowden revelations. Post-Snowden, everyone now is, or most people are inherently suspicious of intelligence agencies. So I think stories like this now have a bit of credence. They are a bit more interesting to the wider public. The media are listening to this a lot more than they would do pre-Snowden revelations. The internet phenomenon, I can go onto the internet and find any answer I want if I punch it in, and it gives me what I want. I think people are missing the broader point here with respect of the British intelligence agencies have a very good relationship with US intelligence agencies and the Five Eyes. The Five Eyes have always worked together. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, America and UK were always going to work closely together. And I think Trump and his team are stepping on very dangerous ground at the moment by these accusations. They need to back it up with some tangible evidence. If it is evidence, and if it is true, I will be very, very shocked. But from where I'm standing, the 10 years experience I've got, having worked with GCHQ and wider intelligence communities, I can tell you categorically this is not something that would be entertained at any level.
Ben Owen, Crispin Black, thank you. Let's bring in our security correspondent, Frank Gardner. Is it a ridiculous claim, Frank?
Let's look at the facts here. It's very rare indeed for GCHQ or any of Britain's intelligence agencies, MI5 and MI6, to come out and publicly deny anything like this. So for them to take this step, they must be pretty sure of what they're saying, because they would look absolute fools. They would have their credibility totally destroyed if they were to come out and deny it, and then it turned out to be true. So, you know, usually they say we neither confirm nor deny. As you know, we'd never comment on matters of intelligence. This time they have, because they wanted to nip this in the bud. The source of this is a media commentator, a former judge, speaking on Fox News. So it's not as if it's sourced from somewhere solid. It's a comment that's been picked up by the White House. But this is a really dangerous development, because just as your two commentators were mentioning there, Britain and the United States have the closest intelligence cooperation sharing of any two nations in the world. And the wider group of Five Eyes, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, US and Britain, they have this very close cooperation. Now, it's unheard of that you could be in a situation where those agencies, which ultimately report to supreme elected political power, number 10 in the Foreign Office in Britain and the White House in the United States, that they are now effectively contradicting that supreme political power in Washington. This is a very unhealthy state of affairs where you've got major real threats, proper threats, North Korea's nuclear weapons development, Iran's missile system, Russia is urgent, etc. These are real threats. This isn't fake news. Those things are happening. Syria, there's some real problems in the world that need to be resolved. You can't have this situation where the White House says one thing and then their major allies, intelligence agencies, well, actually says, no, that's just rubbish. So I think, on balance, I think I probably believe GCHQ, because it would just be, they would look such fools if they were to issue that denial and then it turned out to be true.
What potentially could be the fallout then?
Well, the ball is now back into the court of the White House on this one, because they're already on the back foot because President Trump did that tweet and is standing by his allegation that President Obama ordered a wiretap on Trump Tower, of which there is so far absolutely no evidence. So they're feeling they've got to find something on this. And if you remember, Sean Spicer, the press spokesman at the White House, has said he didn't get the CIA to do it, he didn't get the NSA, he didn't get the FBI. In other words, none of the US agencies, he did it through GCHQ. That is such a specific allegation about Britain's listening station that they felt compelled to deny it. Now, there is close cooperation between GCHQ and the NSA. They cooperate, and MI5, they cooperate on a lot of things. And just as Crispin Black said, some of the things have come out that are a little bit alarming. I mean, MI5 has allegedly worked with the Americans to develop software quite aggressive, basically hack into people's phones, plot their movements, understand what they're saying. They're not interested in what, sorry, nothing personal to it, but they're not interested in where you do your shopping or I do, you know, where I go. They want to know who's planning terrorist attacks, who's running guns into, you know, cross borders, who's organising, you know, sex trafficking, etc. That's the stuff they're after.
In terms of the allegations of hacking, I mean, is there going to be an inquiry, an investigation? Are we ever going to get to the bottom of it?
Into which bit of hacking?
So into the wiretapping of Trump.
Well, there already is. I mean, the Senate Intelligence Committee has come out and said that so far there is no evidence, but they have given the White House, initially they gave them a very tight deadline, so you've got until tomorrow to come up with evidence. They've extended that by a few days, but they've got less than a week for the White House to come up with this evidence. And I imagine that they're probably thrashing around. I mean, you know, Donald Trump has put the White House in a very difficult position there, because he's tweeted this thing without any evidence to back it up, and he needs to try and find something. So currently, Sean Spicer and the sort of press around the White House are trying to sort of blur the issue. Say, well, he didn't mean specifically that President Obama ordered it. That's what the tweet said. So he's basically got himself in a bit of a bind there. But let's not forget what Crispin Black said. You know, there have been buggings of Angela Merkel's phone. You know, that's pretty embarrassing. There's a lot of distrust right now between Germany and the United States. Germany has very strict laws on anti-surveillance, and which is one of the reasons why they have so few CCTV cameras, which is one of the reasons, again, why it was relatively easy for those terrorist attacks to take place in Germany. Germany's very, because of the Stasi background to East Germany, they're very against surveillance. So, you know, we should try to keep an open mind, but right now, the indications are that allegation about GCHQ is nonsense.
Thank you.
The US government has backed down over claims that British intelligence bugged Donald Trump during the presidential campaign. His press spokesman claimed Britain's GCHQ had tapped his phone. When GCHQ responded that it was nonsense and utterly ridiculous, the White House assured Number 10 that the allegations wouldn't be repeated. Only yesterday, an investigation by the US Senate concluded there was no evidence that President Trump was bugged by US intelligence either. Here's our security correspondent, Frank Gardner.
Caught up in the eye of the storm, Britain's GCHQ surveillance agency, secretly listening in, said the White House, on President-elect Donald Trump's conversations. Not true, says GCHQ, in a rare public rebuttal. It all began with a tweet with Donald Trump alleging on social media Barack Obama had ordered the tapping of his phone calls at Trump Tower in New York. Then came the claim from Fox News that GCHQ may have been behind it.
Sources have told Fox News that President Obama could very easily have, and probably did, use a foreign intelligence service to gather this information for him. And the probable culprit here is called GCHQ. That's
the next thing, that unsubstantiated claim was being quoted by Donald Trump's spokesman.
He used GCHQ
That triggered alarm bells in Whitehall. I'm told it was serious enough to be considered a threat to Britain's national security. It prompted this unprecedented denial by GCHQ. Recent allegations, it said, made by media commentator Judge Andrew Napolitano about GCHQ being asked to conduct wiretapping against the then President-elect are nonsense. They are utterly ridiculous and should be ignored.
This is just not something GCHQ does. The legislation under which it operates doesn't allow it to happen. The governance and the oversight of the organisation just does not allow that kind of thing to happen. So I think in this case it's absolutely clear this is a completely false statement.
If Donald Trump was embarrassed, he wasn't showing it today. Seen here meeting the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel. His administration has promised not to repeat these allegations, but it hasn't actually apologised. So, what's the damage to relations with Washington? MI6, MI5 and GCHQ, Britain's 3 spy agencies, all have incredibly close working relationships with their US counterparts. Whitehall officials insisted today that partnership remains as strong as ever, despite the controversy over wiretapping. Still, it's a bad day for Western intelligence when Britain has to publicly contradict a statement coming out of the highest office of its closest partner, the White House. Frank Gardner, BBC News, outside MI6 headquarters in central London.
Well, let's talk to our North America editor, John Sobel, who's outside the White House. So how embarrassing is this public contradiction that Frank's referring to there, John? Is this something that President Trump will just be able to ride out and won't make any difference to his supporters?
Well, as you say, we haven't had the words "I'm sorry" yet from President Trump, and I wouldn't frankly hold your breath waiting for that to happen. It's hard to overstate the consternation on the British side about what Sean Spicer said. Now, Sean Spicer is saying, I didn't say that GCHQ tapped Donald Trump's phones. I said that it was reported by Fox News that that had happened. That doesn't wash, I don't think, with the British here, and I understand that the ambassador has spoken to Sean Spicer about it, and equally the National Security Advisor, General McMaster, has spoken to his British counterpart, Sir Mark Lyle-Scott. Now, while there's been no formal public apology, I think regrets have been expressed and undertakings given that this won't be repeated. One person I spoke to today who's had close dealings with the administration, he said the normal law of political holes is that when you're in one, you stop digging. This administration brings in a mechanical excavator.
John Sobel at the White House, thank you.
I want to bring you these latest pictures from the White House, where Chancellor Angela Merkel is meeting President Trump. A short time ago, they were sat down exchanging words to one another. We are expecting a news conference to take place a little bit earlier on, but let's have a listen into the conversation, the exchange of words from a little bit earlier on. President Trump told Angela Merkel to send a nice photograph back to Germany. So this is perhaps the beginning of an amicable relationship between these two world leaders. But as I said, Angela Merkel, she's currently talking to Donald Trump at the White House. So will that meeting be friendly or frosty? What can we learn from these world leaders' body gestures? Well, let's talk to behavioural psychologist Dr. Peter Collett from Oxford. He's here to have a closer look. Many thanks indeed for joining us this afternoon. So I want to talk about the body gestures of these two leaders in particular, Angela Merkel, Donald Trump. Regarding President Trump, the most noticeable gesture President Trump has shown is that forceful handshake where he almost pulls an individual towards him. We've seen it time and time again. What is that telling us about President Trump?
Well, it's a really quite unusual piece of behaviour, don't you think? First of all, there are really two aspects to his handshake. One, the hand pat, so he's got hold of the other person's hand, he pats on top of theirs. Now that is intended to look like a friendly gesture, a kind of sign of approval, but in fact its true purpose is as a status reminder. It's his way of telling the other person and everybody else concerned that he's the man who's in charge. But this thing you've referred to, what I call the yank shake, that is very peculiar, and I can't think of anybody else who's ever used it. And there are various explanations as to why he wants to use it. My favourite is the fact that it actually is his attempt, quite unknowingly, to violate the central tenet of a handshake, which, of course, is to express one's equality with the other person. Now, Trump doesn't really want to do that. He wants to appear enthusiastic. He wants to get people slightly off balance. He wants to call the shots. And the yank shake does a lot of that for him.
Let's talk about Angela Merkel now. She is pretty well known, isn't she, for this steeple hand gesture. It became so famous that it featured in her campaign poster. What does it tell us about her?
Yeah, well, there are at least two versions of the steeple handshake. This is the steeple handshake, as it were, upright, but the one she uses is the inverted version. What's interesting is, although Trump and Merkel are quite different politically and in many other ways, they do actually share in common this particular hand gesture. Now, the hand gesture itself is one that people use, again, quite unknowingly, when they're feeling superior to the person who's in their vicinity. So, for example, Tony Blair used to use it quite frequently when he was standing next to George W. You know, he would be paying full attention, but at the same time his hands were giving him away, showing that in fact he was feeling quite superior, justifiably so, to George W. Now, what's actually happening with these two people is they're both alpha individuals, and they are literally leaking out information about their attitude towards other people. In this case, the steeple handshake tells us that they feel superior. So it's somewhat ironic that the German party that she heads should have decided to use this as their icon. But what's really fascinating about Trump's use of the hand gesture is the fact that and we've seen it just moments ago when he was sitting in the White House, with Merkel, is that he's got a slightly different version of it. Not only does he put the tips of his fingers together, but he taps away rather impatiently. So he's sending two messages. One, I'm the guy who's superior, and two, let's get the hell out of here as soon as possible.
Okay, we're just going to keep watching these two leaders. I mean, so do you think? I mean, you're talking a little bit about that. President Trump is trying to send a message. Angela Trump is trying to send a message. Do you think the other person is reading that message and understands what they're trying to do?
No, I don't think so, not necessarily. I mean, Merkel is fully aware that this is her signature hand posture. Everybody knows it in Germany, and in fact, we now know it pretty well in other parts of the world as well. You know, this is not something that she's done deliberately, but it's something that she emits unconsciously. But it's not as though she's trying to send a message. What's happening is she's thinking and feeling certain things which give rise to these behaviors. So these behaviors are very much giveaways. But there's also something quite interesting. I mean, watching what's happened so far, one can't help but be struck by the fact that it does seem pretty friendly, although rather abrupt. And that is one of the features of Trump's relationship with visiting heads of state. For the most part, he tries to move them on. Not always, and sometimes to his detriment, as we saw, for example, with Shinzo Abe, the Japanese Prime Minister, where he hung on to his hand for a full 19 seconds and managed to pat his hand, I think, 6 times.
Wow, it's fascinating stuff. I just want to talk to you about Donald Trump's smile. We've seen this occasion after occasion.
Yeah.
Often looks like he's a Cheshire cat, often looks like he's the cat that got the cream. What can we glean from this smile?
Yeah. Well, that is one of a range of smiles that he uses. He does use the full-blown smile, what psychologists call the Duchenne smile, where you get, these muscles yanking up the corners of the mouth, full exposure of the teeth, wrinkling around the eyes. That is the genuine thing. And he does do that. And we saw that, for example, when he's visiting, when other people whom he's fond of, like Farage, come to visit him. But in this case, what he's doing is he's using a kind of polite version of the smile. It's what I've called a zipped smile, because what we have instead of these muscles yanking up the corners is we have these muscles on the side pulling the corners of the mouth away from each other. In other words, elongating the mouth. Now, this is a non-committal smile. It doesn't expose the teeth. It doesn't involve the zygomatic muscles or these muscles around the eyes, which are the signs of genuine pleasure. It's just his way of going through the motions. But there are other things at play here. First of all, it makes his mouth look much wider, which is, again, related to status. Men who are in charge of large organizations tend to have larger mouths, and that's in effect what he's simulating the process by stretching his mouth sideways. There's also, of course, the very faint possibility that he's behaving in a rather British fashion. I mean, he has, Scottish ancestors, and throughout the British Isles, there's much more of a tendency for us to smile using something like the zip smile, where we don't expose our teeth, rather than those smiles in which we do, for the very simple reason that historically, the British have had rather bad teeth, and this is a kind of remnant that's lived on through the centuries.
Finally, Peter, I mean, to what extent will Donald Trump's people be very conscious of these bodily gestures that he does produce? Will they be monitoring him? Will they be talking to him? Will they be saying, look, Mr. President, you need to work on this because you are sending the wrong kind of message, or you're sending the right kind of message? I mean, what extent are people going to be really concerned about these various hand gestures, the smiles, everything that we've been talking about this afternoon?
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, we can see that other politicians, most notably, the Canadian Prime Minister, was very well drilled before he actually met Trump. And in fact, all his attempts were designed to, as it were, neuter Trump's attempts, any attempt he might have made to strong-arm him. Now, I'm not sure about Trump. I think some of his hand gestures are certainly overschooled. For example, his tendency to expose his palms, that's not his natural way of behaving. It's a very embracing, kind of open, non-macho way of behaving. Whereas most of the time, most alphas tend to give themselves away by using high dominance gestures. And he doesn't use a lot of those all the time. Now, I don't think that when it comes to smiling, for example, his team has been taking him aside and saying, Donald, you've got to regulate this. We've got to have a little bit more of this kind of smiling. What they will do to him is say, look, it's absolutely critical that when you meet Merkel, it comes across as a kind of egalitarian, rather warm, inclusive, almost embracing kind of encounter. And that's what he's managed to do so far, by the way. Certainly outside on the steps of the White House, it does seem as though they were good old mates. There were no indications, and I suspect this is something to do with the fact that he's been drilled in advance. There were absolutely no indications of the history that the two of them share. They're really quite almost deep animosity towards each other.
Peter, fascinating talking to you. We could talk about this for hours on end, but time is against us as ever. Many thanks indeed for joining us this afternoon.
Now, the White House has assured Britain it won't repeat allegations that the eavesdropping agency GCHQ was used by Barack Obama to spy on Donald Trump before last year's election. Number 10 dismissed the allegations as ridiculous. Mr. Trump faced questions about it at his press conference with the German Chancellor Angela Merkel this afternoon, and our Washington correspondent Kylie Morris is at the White House. Kylie.
Chris, this was the long-awaited meeting between Angela Merkel and President Trump. Of course, as a candidate, he missed no opportunity to roundly criticise her at every opportunity, her weak immigration policies, the disaster of the European Union. So no one expected it to be warm, and it hasn't been. Let's take a look at a moment from a photo opportunity earlier in the day. Here they are in the Oval Office, and as we were saying, what's noticeable is that he is looking away from her the whole time. He never glances toward her.
Send a good picture back to Germany, please.
He asked the photographers to take nice pictures of them. He says that they talked about many things. She, for her part, says that it was a congenial meeting. It was very good. He's obviously tiring a little of these repeated questions from the reporters. You see him look off to one side to a press aide to wrap things up. And the photographers are calling out for a handshake at this point. She leans forward and seems to say, what about a handshake? We don't know whether or not he heard her, but look at the expression on her face. She looks bemused. So that was the handshake that wasn't. The press conference that's just finished hasn't been a lot better, I've got to say. The most interesting moment, I think, was a German journalist asking a question of President Trump about whether it had been a mistake to blame the British for somehow enabling President Obama to spy on Trump Tower, to wiretap Trump Tower. This claim, of course, that President Trump made a couple of weeks ago, for which there is, it seems, no evidence, and he's been roundly criticised. The story moved on yesterday with Sean Spicer saying that GCHQ, according to a Fox report, was somehow involved in enabling that. The president responded to the question in the press conference with a joke, referencing the time back in 2010 when Angela Merkel herself was wiretapped by US intelligence agencies, although we know that that actually happened.
As far as wiretapping, I guess, by this past administration, at least we have something in common, perhaps. And just to finish your question, we said nothing. All we did was quote a certain very talented legal mind who was the one responsible for saying that on television. I didn't make an opinion on it. So you shouldn't be talking to me, you should be talking to Fox, okay?
So a real doubling down, if you like, by President Trump, but a diplomatic challenge today. And I think the distance very definitely remains between these two leaders.
Thanks, Kylie. Well, earlier, the satirist and author P.J. O'Rourke spoke to me from Washington. And although he's a lifelong Republican, he's no fan of Trump and famously voted for Hillary Clinton. And I started by asking him why in his latest book he describes Trump as a big, stupid bully.
He's a strange mixture of cunning and cleverness and stupidity. I've been telling everybody in the United States that the way you have to deal with Donald Trump is you have to take yourself back to the time when you were raising toddlers, and it's like, oh, what a very clever child you are. Oh, no, now you've crayoned all over the wall, I mean, he has a toddler-like mix of cleverness and with huge blank spots in between.
But why do you think Americans who are now discovering what his cuts are going to mean for their lives thought that he was going to be an ally, that he was like them? I mean, have they been conned or were they stupid?
Well, no, I don't think they were stupid. I think they were desperate. Trump was a naive choice. So I would say. And then again, how disappointed will his supporters be? Well, it won't be for a while because we're in the business. We follow this all very carefully, and we're seeing indications of complete clumsiness and ignorance from the president. But people who don't follow politics at a micro level aren't going to see this for another 5 or 6 months. And for a while, Trump supporters will be satisfied that everything Trump does seems to make the liberals and the mainstream media and all the pundits like myself makes us furious, and they'll be happy about that for a while.
Doesn't it then make it quite easy for him to win another term? I mean, all he needs to do is win some jobs, do something in those Rust Belt states that he can claim is his, and he'll say, well, I'm doing what I said I'd do.
Yeah, well, that's a long way out. A second term is a long way out. And, one never, ever in this world wants to wish for a crisis. But, all the wounds in the Trump administration have been self-administered. Our bomb squads here in the United States have a term for people who are making bombs and blow themselves up. And it's called a self-criticizing exercise. Wonderful phrase, I think. And so everything with the Trump administration so far has been a self-criticizing exercise. But trouble will come from the outside. And when, and it's not a matter of if, but when that crisis happens, then I think we'll see the mettle of the man, and I don't think there's much mettle there.
Do you think it will have to be a really big crisis, though? Because what we see is, as you say, all these sort of self-inflicted wounds don't seem to matter. I mean, the latest one about whether British intelligence were the ones who were really bugging him, which British intelligence have said, well, GCHQ have said was rubbish and shouldn't be believed, and then the White House have said, OK, we won't say that anymore. I mean, that in the old days would have been regarded as a massive gaffe.
Yes, I mean, we definitely are in the off into the blowhard era, and you know, I think people do recognize that he's a blowhard, but gosh, it's just such a strange phenomenon to have the President of the United States that all of his aides and his press secretary and so are forced into using air quotes about everything that he says. And it's so 90s, you know, I thought air quotes had kind of gone out of fashion, but no, they've suddenly come back in, and, you know, oh, well, you got to understand, you know, I mean, he's just blowing off some steam here. It's, you know, when it's not like dealing with a toddler, it's like dealing with a drunk uncle, you know, at Christmas dinner, you know, I mean, and he doesn't drink. That's the scary part.
PJ O'Rourke, thank you very much.
Donald Trump has just met Angela Merkel in Washington. Emily is there.
Thanks, James. Good evening from Washington. In recent times, President Trump has shown himself a rather enthusiastic advocate of the handshake. Sometimes they've appeared to go on painfully long. But today was not one of those times. He rejected the formal clinch with German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and the two faced off in a rather awkward tension to the shout of handshake from press photographers, mirroring in their body language what we know already of their political differences. This, it was clear from the start, was never going to be a love-in, but the air was decidedly cool. And at the heart of it lay that question of America's broader interaction with the world. Would his America First policy mean an isolationist approach to foreign policy? Donald Trump's been deeply critical of foreign trade and national security agreements, but the president suggested he was only trying to revise them to serve US interests, not to pull back from the world entirely. His blueprint for a budget, released a little earlier this week, suggested he'd like a huge rise in defense spending and big cuts to the State Department, which does all the diplomacy. Diplomacy, as we know, not always his strongest suit. When he was asked today whether he regretted any of those past tweets about Angela Merkel, he replied, very seldom. Here's a reminder then of that curious relationship. When he was first elected, support for Mr. Trump was conditional at best.
Germany and America are connected through shared values: democracy, freedom, respect of the law and dignity of man, independent of origin, colour of skin, religion, gender, sexual orientation or political views. On the basis of these values, I am offering the future US President Donald Trump close cooperation.
Chancellor Merkel, it is a great honor to welcome you to the People's House, the White House.
So what will that look like then for the world? Joining us now, Jeffrey Rathke, Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Europe Programme at CSIS, and Constance Stelson, Senior Fellow at Brookings. It's lovely to have you both here. Let's just get this handshake, or the non-handshake, out of the way first. Do you think that was an arrangement? Do you think it was a mistake? Who comes out of that looking awkward and who's stronger?
Well, I think if you look at the greeting at the West Wing, they shook hands, came into the building. It was an awkward moment in the Oval Office. I think that we'll forget over time. But I think what they talked about and their press availability, that leaves a lot to try to dissect.
A certain coolness from Merkel probably does her no disfavour at home, right, Constanza? Does she?
Yeah, I mean, she knows full well that the American president is deeply unpopular at home, and she was walking a thin line between being professional and seeking a working relationship with Germany's most important transatlantic ally and not making a fool of herself. I think she succeeded rather well in this. And she, you know, she did even manage to plug in a bit of dry wit from time to time. And if you saw her bemused smile when he made that crack about the wiretapping, you could see that she was very relaxed as well.
So where is this relationship going then? I mean, will they get on and do trade together? It was very odd that there was no mention, almost a sort of, you know, a silence where the European Union would have been.
Right. I think if we peel away the atmospherics and ask where is the transatlantic relationship today, how is it different than it was yesterday? I think if you look at security and cooperation on fighting terrorism, you see some progress. If you talk about trade, I think we're left with a lot of questions because, as you said, the president was not ready to say the words European Union even though he's heard about it from Merkel. He heard about it yesterday from the Irish Taoiseach, and he heard about it from Theresa May, who said a strong EU is in Britain's interest.
Enda Kenny was very keen to enforce just how critical the EU is for Ireland's interests.
That's right.
So what is it that Donald Trump doesn't want to, if you like, face up to in the EU? Is it that he won't trade with that as a body because he thinks that trade should be done on an individual?
We know from his advisors that they think the EU is essentially a front, a smokescreen for German domination of Europe, and the Germans are using the EU and the euro as a front for their own national interests. I would say that portrays a certain lack of understanding of how the EU actually works, and that it does work for other countries. And in fact, Germany's options of manipulating the EU and in fact the currency are relatively limited. The European Central Bank has been doing quantitative easing against the violent protests
But Constance, he's
of
not
the
he
government.
won't not trade with Germany. He won't not trade with the body, right? So in a sense,
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
all-
He doesn't really have a choice. And I think, look, I think Merkel was quite right to not push him on this, because you're not going to have a seminar on European Union theory in front of the president and the world press, right? I think she will leave that on the table as a learning process to be had. There are, after all, a G20 meeting and a G70 meeting in the spring. But I think the important thing was that she said, don't forget that there's a lot of German investment and jobs created by Germans in America. And she mentioned the word reciprocity, which is a very thinly veiled threat that if you do punitive taxes, so can we.
What was interesting, though, was that he definitely was emphatic about the fact he wasn't rowing back from an involvement in the world, that this America first, he said, was not an isolationist policy, and that he said he quite liked NATO. Now, it's all sort of relative, isn't it? But he was talking at one stage about, what, arrears, is it? This idea that you would get those countries who hadn't paid their dues to actually pay back tax.
This is an idea that has come up a couple of times, and he seems not to be backing away from it. If you look at what he said two quite positive things. He said, "I'm a supporter of NATO." He recognized Germany's efforts to spend 2% of GDP in line with what NATO has agreed, starting in Wales in 2014. And then he said that there are nations that owe, as he put it, vast sums of money for past years, which is not something that NATO leaders have ever agreed to. There's no concept of arrears. And so where this comes from is unclear, but it's certainly not going to fly. So if this remains part of the US agenda before the NATO summit that will happen at the end of May.
How do you know it's not going to fly, though? I mean, I know it goes against everything that you think.
This is simply one way in which NATO is not like a golf club. If you fail to pay your dues, they don't pile up and you pay them. It just doesn't work that way.
But maybe could he withhold, as he has done, the mutual defence?
I think he likes to threaten that he will find that doesn't work. And that the other member states, including Canada, will say, we don't do it this way. And particularly,
but nobody's going to boot the US out of NATO, in a sense.
No, but the US isn't going to boot the Germans out. It's not going to happen. So basically, the Germans and other Europeans can make a very persuasive point that they have in fact been increasing their defence budgets ever since 2014, the aggression of the Russians in Crimea and Ukraine, and that they're on course to having much higher defence budgets. They can also make a very sensible case that actually successful defence of Europe is not all military. In fact, it resides in the political realm as well, particularly where the Russians are engaging in, across the board, propaganda warfare within the EU.
If I could just add one thing to that, and I think that what you also have here is a growing political consensus in the Congress especially, that the forward defense of Europe is defense of America. So, I think that is also a changing element here that's important to keep in mind. And there are other ways. The U.S. administration could ask countries to raise their spending faster. There are other ways to try to move this along.
If we look at where we are now, 2 months into the Trump administration, what this tells us more broadly about Trump's foreign policy, one thing that has become clear is that, in a sense, he does not really put a vast value on diplomacy. His skinny budget, as it's called, talks about cutting the State Department. You know the State Department well, you were there, and putting more money into defence. Now, whether or not he gets his budget through is a different thing, but clearly for him, the State Department and that diplomacy isn't very valuable, right?
No, I think his generals would beg to disagree with him. I think, knowing the American military, they would be the first to say, look, yes, of course, we'd always like more money for defense, but if you cut the development budget and if you cut the State Department budget like this, we will be left holding babies that we don't want to hold. We will be asked by you to solve problems that we cannot solve, and in fact, you will make our life worse.
Call, right? I mean, whether it works, whether it doesn't, he does it with a phone call and a tweet. So why do you have to send Rex Tillerson
I think there
halfway
are
around the
entrenched
world?
forces of resistance.
And I think, let's keep in mind, we're at a point where we're not yet dealing with an international crisis. We're talking about a largely theoretical discussion where Congress is lining up in quite a different place. And I think, as Constanza rightly pointed out, the Department of Defense, including the Secretary of Defense, they value the contribution that diplomats make because they do things that you can't ask the military to do, whether that is development in some cases, or it's civilian security assistance, working with law enforcement, working with the officials who can help fight terrorism and share information with the United States, things that our military, as good as it is at so many things, that they really just aren't trained to do.
And don't want to do, because they know full well that others are better at doing it and should be doing it. So I would expect significant resistance there. And I don't, frankly, expect the President to have a lot of success with this idea.
Thank you both very much indeed. Thanks for coming in here.